Steam locomotives have taken on all shapes and sizes over the years, from small, practical shunters to large, elegant streamliners. It's undeniable that steam locomotives have always had a unique and striking appearance, but none might be more unique in appearance than a few tank engines that can only be described as sheds on wheels. In 1883, the Great Eastern Railway opened a tramway connecting Upwell to the market town of Wisbech to transport both goods and passengers. The original proposed plans for the railway were expensive, so to save money, the Great Eastern Railway built it as a tramway in line with the Tramways Act of 1870. This meant the line could follow the public road without the need to put up fences or any similar protection that a standard railway required, making it much cheaper to build. However, it also meant that the locomotives that were to operate on the line needed a significant amount of safe-proofing. When tasked with designing the engines that were to run on the line, Locomotive Superintendent Thomas Worsdell came up with an unusual 040 tank engine. The water was stored in a large flat tank mounted above the wheels but below the boiler, the tank doubling as the footplate for both the driver and the fireman. The locomotive could also be driven from both ends, allowing the driver to stand at the front of the engine for a much clearer view, and it had a short 6-foot 6-inch wheelbase, allowing it to negotiate the tight curves of the line. Along with this, it was fitted with a bell to warn pedestrians, cow catchers to prevent anything from being dragged under the wheels, side covers to protect the wheels in motion, a spark arrestor on the funnel, speed governors that, when enabled, limited the engine's speed to 8 miles an hour for when it travelled on a public road, and, to reduce noise, the steam from the safety valves was piped into the water tank. A wooden body was built on top of the engine to protect the footplate crew from the elements, leaving enough space for the driver to move from one end to the other without having to leave the locomotive. The end result looked less like a railway engine and more like a guard's van. Classified as G15s, 3 were built and put to work on the Wisbech and Upwell tramway in 1883, running with little issue on the line. Finding them to be ideal for running on public roads, 2 more were built for the Yarmouth Union Tramway in 1885, with a further 5 being built for the Wisbech and Upwell tramway between 1891 and 1897 as traffic on the line increased. The G15s worked hard, but by 1903 were starting to struggle during the busy harvest seasons, and so it was decided better engines were needed for the work. James Holden, who'd replaced Worsdell as locomotive superintendent, designed what was essentially an upgraded version of the G15s. These having an 060 wheel arrangement, outside cylinders, an improved boiler, and were some of the earliest engines in Britain to use Walschwartz valve gear. Despite having an extra set of wheels, these new engines still only had a wheelbase of 6 foot 8 inches, just 2 inches longer than their 040 counterparts. Aside from that, the 060s were functionally identical to the G15s, capable of being driven from both ends, safety valves feeding into the water tank, and fitted with bell, cow catchers, side plates, and a wooden body. In fact, the engines were so identical that once they had their bodies fitted, it was almost impossible to tell them apart. The main distinguishing feature was that the new designs had a foothold set in the side of the water tanks. Classified as C53s, 2 of these new trams were built in 1903 and put to work around the Ipswich dock area. Proving to be reliable, another 3 were built in 1908, and by 1921, 12 of these engines were working on the Great Eastern Railway. 3 working on the Wisbech and Upwell tramway, 3 on the Yarmouth Union tramway, and 6 around Ipswich docks. Eventually, the trams ended up under LNER ownership after the railway grouping of 1921, with the G15s reclassified as Y6s and the C53s reclassified as J70s. Despite their odd shape, small size, and speed limiters, the trams were by no means poor performers. It's noted that the J70s in particular could reach impressively high speeds when not on public roads, and that on one occasion, number 7131 managed to pull 48 trucks fully loaded with fruit, totaling 400 tons in weight, though partway through the journey it did have to uncouple from the train and run to the next station to fill up with water. By the time of the grouping, 4 Y6s had been taken out of service, and after passenger services between Wisbech and Upwell stopped in 1927, 2 more were scrapped by 1933. Despite being replaced, the Y6s still found some use doing odd jobs, with 2 working in Neasden during the 1924-25 Wembley exhibition, and another was displayed at the 1925 Stockton and Darlington Centenary procession. Eventually, the last 4 Y6s ended up in storage on the Wisbech line along with 3 other J70s, these only being used in busy seasons. Another 2 J70s would run the line for the rest of the year. Servicing the trams was awkward, as the wooden bodies needed to be maintained by the carriage and wagon department of the railway. Initially, the wood was just varnished, but smoke and gases from the engines that built up in the running sheds would have quickly ruined the finish, and so they were painted teak brown instead, later changing to their more well-known darker crimson brown by 1921. Their tanks and metal skirting meanwhile were painted wartime grey, blue and later black, as regulations for street trams required them to avoid being painted bright colours. Should the engine itself require extensive servicing, the wooden body would have to be removed entirely along with the cowcatcher and side plates, further complicating what was a straightforward process for many other engines. But their shortcomings weren't just limited to maintenance. The water tanks were also an issue. Though big enough for the work they did, on longer journeys or when pulling heavier loads, they often found themselves needing to refill frequently. Not to mention the wooden body made the footplate uncomfortably hot for engine crews. And finally, even with all their extra safety features, they were still relatively dangerous when travelling along highways. Horses were often scared of the trams despite the efforts taken to reduce the amount of noise they made. And on the Wisbech and Upwell line especially, the trams were frequently involved in accidents. Low-speed collisions with people not paying attention or slow-moving carts were expected, but the main problem was how trams initially would pick up and drop off passengers anywhere on the line, with many people climbing on and off as the carriages were still in motion. It even became somewhat of a game for young boys to try and hop aboard moving trams to get a free ride, but this often resulted in people falling from the train and getting caught in the wheels of the carriage. After many injuries and multiple fatalities, the line eventually only let people on and off at designated stations or requested stops. By 1941, only 2 Y6s remained, both being moved to the Wissington Light Railway to help move sugar beet during the war. The poor condition of the tracks caused them to derail, and so they were once again replaced by 2 J70s. Y6 number 7134 ended up working for the US Army Transportation Corps at Burton-on-Trent before being transferred to the Sinfin Lake Royal Ordnance Depot near Derby. One of the J70s was scrapped in 1942, leaving 11 under the ownership of British Railways following the war, along with the last 2 Y6s. They continued to work for several years, but the Y6's lack of power was becoming a problem, and so both were withdrawn by 1952. The J70s meanwhile were still able to run their tramways, but were soon replaced by Class 04 shunting diesels, with the last 4 being withdrawn in 1955. Tragically, 1 Y6 and 1 J70 were marked for preservation, but through complications, both were scrapped. The Y6 was kept at the Stratford paint shop for a year before being cut up in 1953. The J70 on the other hand was stored at Stratford Works in 1955 while awaiting preservation, but through error was cut up. A silver lining to the story is that this mistake led to the formation of the Consultative Panel for the Preservation of Historical Transport Relics, which in turn have gone on to preserve many other locomotives that might have otherwise faced the cutter's torch. Though they weren't the fastest, nor the most powerful engines built in Britain, the fact they had such a long working life despite their unusual design just goes to show that looks aren't what makes the engine, and that, sometimes, it can be hip to be square. Subscribe for more.